The will of the people, as expressed at the ballot box, is sovereign.
And he said, Bertie, we worked something out. He says, you're the only one in this room, as far as we know, that hasn't murdered somebody.
I enjoyed almost every minute of it. And obviously, I would have liked to have done it for a little while longer.
The first thing John Major said, you have to tell me about Ireland. I don't know anything about Ireland. Or maybe the Prime Minister, but I don't know anything about it.
Within an hour, I found myself in a lot more trouble than I expected to be in.
We are living way beyond our means.
The Irish government can no longer stand by and see innocent people injured.
When is the general election likely to be?
Well, it's not due till February next year, and it'll be sometime between now and then.
It's in the interest of the country. If responsibility should now pass to a younger man.
The Irish nation was in a disgraceful condition under the external relation.
We do not wish to seek quarrels with any country.
The apparatus through which I am now speaking affords one very stimulating thought that gives no opportunity for the opposition to interrupt.
In 1994, following the collapse of the Fianna Fáil Labour coalition, Albert Reynolds resigned as Taoiseach. The Labour leader, Dick Spring, then began negotiations to form another government.
We then literally crossed the floor of the House and started talking to Fine Gael and the Workers' Party. And, you know, John Bruton and I, who didn't have great chemistry in previous coalitions we were in, we started putting together. Nobody wanted a general election. We'd had that experience before of snap elections. And we managed to put together a programme for government.
Well, John Bruton was unusual in that he came to power not through a general election, but following the collapse of the Labour Fianna Fáil government under Reynolds, and he very successfully negotiated the Rainbow Coalition, which was, I think, a pretty good government in retrospect.
The way I looked at it was that while I was the Taoiseach, I was the chairman of a cabinet of 15 people, and I, in terms of political management, shared the power with the two other party leaders in government, who were tremendous colleagues, to have Dick Spring and Prince de Rossi.
I would have had concerns at the time, if you like, going into a three-party coalition. You know, that required new chemistry, particularly when two of those parties weren't very friendly in particular. And I think John Bruton did an excellent job at working up the chemistry to keep the Workers' Party and ourselves working together.
He surprised everybody in many ways. For instance, Prince de Rossi of Democratic Left, and if you look where they came from, you know, himself and Britain became inseparable buddies and agreed easily on most of the major issues of the day. And you would have thought these people are absolute political polar opposites, but they get on with it, and he was very good at that.
There was less actual difference on policy issues between Labour and Fine Gael and the Democratic Left at that time. There was, by 1994, there was more of a consensus.
That cabinet, I would say about 90% of its discretionary time, and you're a cabinet minister at the moment, and you know how very little discretionary time there is. 90% of the discretionary time of the three cabinets that I've been involved in was focused pretty much on Northern Ireland. When the Rainbow government was formed, Dick Spring was already 2 years in foreign affairs, and an awful lot of the work that Albert had started, Dick was central to because he was Minister for Foreign Affairs. There was a lot of things ready to happen.
The basis for the peace process is the Downing Street Declaration negotiated by Albert Reynolds and John Major. It says, first of all, that for parties to enter into talks, and this is in paragraph 10, that there must be, on their part, a permanent end to violence and a permanent end to support for violence. Now, while the IRA did announce a ceasefire in August of 1994, they did not say that this was permanent, and they did not say that they were permanently withdrawing support for the option of violence in the future. We, John Major and I, had been trying to find a way of getting over this problem, and I was pushing the idea of a sort of twin-track approach, that we would have one pillar of talks dealing with the political settlement. But so that decommissioning and militarism issues wouldn't contaminate that, we would have a separate pillar of talks on the decommissioning questions. So we went over, I went over to Downing Street, and we finalised the twin-track approach.
The handshake of the day, the British and Irish Prime Ministers as they joined forces to launch their document to help the peace process, they said. It's only increased the shivers down the Unionist spine.
John Major was paralysed because he had the bastards, as he called them, the Eurosceptics, yes, and he was struggling with the disintegrating majority. And the
he was also dependent on the Unionist votes.
He was also dependent on the Unionist votes.
He had to bow to them and to their needs.
An awful lot of work was done by Bruton and by Spring with a very reluctant Major. I know Bruton really tore the socks off Major on one occasion and just really put steel up his back and got him to sign up for the final declaration.
You know, I didn't ring John Major just once. I rang him 2 or 3, 4 times until I got the answer I was looking for, and until I was able to get on the plane and go over to London and finalise the thing. And you know, I felt very proud of that, to be honest with you, because it was a major breakthrough. It wasn't expected.
If the parties don't like what's in here, then the parties can produce something else. We have the clear indication of where we all wish to get. If they don't like this, put forward something else.
I join with the Prime Minister in appealing to all the parties concerned to grasp this opportunity.
In the framework document, which I finalised, a series of assurances for the nationalist community in Northern Ireland. But I believe that in setting the scene for a unionist reconciliation with nationalists, we were creating the best possible conditions for the nationalist community in Northern Ireland to live peaceful and productive lives.
Our perspective, as it were, against Bruton is that a Taoiseach should speak for the nationalists. And there was certainly a view that John Bruton was voicing the concerns of the Unionists,
but Mary,
which wasn't his job.
But that was the lesson from the Anglo-Irish Agreement. We assumed that the British Prime Minister would speak for the Unionists. Yes. But the British didn't see the Unionists as British. They saw them as Irish. Yeah, and John Bruton saw them as Irish as well as being Union.
And fairness to John Bruton, in many ways, he just didn't understand. He didn't get it. This is a guy who said that Prince Charles, the British prince, was one of his great heroes. And he licked the royal arse at a toast in Dublin when he toasted Her Royal Majesty the Queen, while the Queen's troops were beating the hell out of people in prisons and in housing estates and in rural villages throughout the 6 counties. So John just didn't understand.
I was trying both to reassure the Unionist community that in Dublin they would find a government that would uphold the rule of law, with whom they could do business and that would respect their religious and political convictions. But also I was trying to address the Irish nationalist community in the Republic and in Northern Ireland and saying to them, look, you're the majority on the island. If you want a peaceful settlement and if you want the Unionist community to come towards an acceptance of an all-Ireland approach, you, as the bigger community, has to make a special effort to try to understand Unionist fears.
I heard him referred to by senior Irish politicians from Leinster House as Johnny Unionist. Now, I mean, I have to stress, he was a very professional politician. He was decent and good to work with. He just didn't have a clue of what was required, and he was heading of a government which didn't have any national fibre in it.
His government contained personalities who were well known, including Bruton himself, having good faith on the Northern issue from a Unionist point of view. Now, that led to a lot of criticisms from nationalists and from Sinn Féin in particular, and frustration. But it is also the case that without John Bruton, you would not have had that undertow within mainstream unionism towards accepting the idea of some kind of deal.
I think, to be fair to Bruton, you have to acknowledge there was a stage in the peace process where it was inevitable that the IRA ceasefire was going to break down. The provosts were not ready all in one go to get from where they were to where they needed to go. And even though Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness were handling this process with incredible skill, it was inevitable at some point that there was going to be a failure.
On the 9th of February 1996, the IRA detonated a bomb in London's Dockland district. The bomb killed 2 people and brought an end to the IRA's 17-month ceasefire.
It broke down because of the high-handed attitude of the British government. Of course, had there been a leadership on the island which was genuinely embracing the platform which had been put together, then it's likely that the cessation would not have broken down. But when a British government was not being checked, so here you had a British government which was malign. This was a malign, this was a Tory government. So not only had it got the IRA on ceasefire, it wasn't engaging in talks with Sinn Féin, and we were all elected officials, all of our leadership were elected by Irish electorate. But not only had the IRA stymied, they weren't dealing with the Sinn Féin leadership, and they had an Irish government which was beating the same drum, in fact had actually made a drum and give it to them.
This was obviously a very long planned operation by the IRA. It took quite a long time logistically for them to assemble the ingredients for the explosion that killed Inan Bashir and John Jeffrey at Canary Wharf. But I'm glad to say that having done that, I think eventually the Republican movement realized that that was a complete dead end, and I'm glad to say that subsequently not only did they restore their ceasefire, but subsequently they decommissioned all their weapons, which they had to do for the settlement to ultimately bed down.
Anglo-Irish relations and the peace process were central to John Bruton's tenure as Taoiseach. However, constitutional reform was also high on his agenda. In 1995, a referendum to abolish the prohibition on divorce was passed. Other developments during Bruton's term saw significant growth in the economy.
We were beginning to see economic recovery at that stage. We had gotten our public finances under control, and I think there was a much better understanding of what you could spend and what you couldn't spend. And we began to get the foreign investment. We began to, I think, create export markets. And we certainly were beginning to see addressing the unemployment issue.
With Rory Quinn from the Labour Party as the Minister for Finance, it was the first time in 27 years that a budgetary surplus was actually returned. And when that coalition, when the Rainbow left office in '97, as I say, you were on the edge of an explosion of surplus monies for the country.
I think there's only one requirement in life: to leave things a little bit better than you found them. And I have to say that in terms of the condition of the country by the end of '97, we did leave the country in much better shape than we'd found it originally back in '92.
As soon as John Bruton arrived by chopper in Cork, he signalled that the gloves were now off in this election campaign. While he may have embraced Kathleen Lynch of Democratic Left, he was making it clear that he had no love at all for Bertie Ahern.
The Rainbow partners have accused Bertie Ahern of running through this campaign and not stopping to deal with the issues. but today he was on the stump again in Cork, continuing his frenetic pace of meeting the people.
John Bruton tried to stand on his record, whereas Bertie Ahern actually managed to connect with people in the way that he went around the country in his whistle-stop tour, shaking hands with everyone, going on, the likeability factor very much coming into play. He was also unlucky in the sense that he suffered at the hands of independent newspapers in the run-up to that particular election as well.
I worked in the Irish Independent, and on election day in 1997, the Irish Independent wrote a front-page editorial. It's called Payback Time. And what the Independent was saying was that, you know, especially the middle classes had been taxed, and it was time to give some money back to people, let them spend it themselves. They might be better at spending them.
You know, unfortunately, we got into the election campaign in '97, and the Irish Independent decided it was payback time, and decided that they wanted to change their government and to exercise their influence.
Bertie stormed the country. He just stormed the country. The people loved him, and we didn't sweep into power with a big majority, not at all. We just about made it, but it was a huge job of work, and he carried the country with him.
We concluded negotiations with the Progressive Democrats and with Mary Harney as leader. They went to government. We knew what we were going to do, and we got on with it.
I'm very happy that I got the chance. Obviously, I would have liked to have done it for a little while longer. I don't think it's a job you should be doing for too long either, because I think it's very important to stay grounded, that you don't lose the run of yourself. And obviously you don't lose the run of yourself in 2.5 years. I certainly didn't.
When the Ceann Comhairle read his name out, Mr. Ahern finally achieved his ambition when he was elected Taoiseach.
For me, it was a job that I kind of left the house at 6:30 in the morning, and if I finished at 10 o'clock at night, I felt I did an easy day. You know, if there wasn't some crisis that had you studying briefs into the early hours of the morning, or if you were back to the north tomorrow. So, I mean, it was an all-consuming job, and trying to pull parties together in a coalition government. You know, preparing yourself for European councils, or, you know, meetings at the United Nations, or God knows what. I mean, the list is endless. But once you kept the thing rolling, so you had to deal with the McCracken Tribunal issues and the Ray Burke issues and all of the other things that are thrown in on you. But if you know, once you keep the head and keep going, you can actually handle it.
This tribunal was originally set up to investigate an allegation that £30,000 had been paid to Ray Burke in connection with the planning of certain lands in North Dublin.
That was very difficult for him because, of course, he had put Ray Burke into cabinet, and hot on the heels of that then came the Charlie Hoy revelations in full 3D. And, of course, from that, hence was born the era of the lengthy tribunals, because everybody was going to be hauled to a tribunal, and everybody in the land almost. He reacted well in that he took action pretty immediately, and I suppose for a Taoiseach at that point, that's what he had to do.
This will be the image remembered in history. The Ulster Unionist and Sinn Féin leaders applauding the same thing, a peace deal. By reaching an agreement in this room, all the parties did what many people said couldn't be done.
The major achievement of Bertie Ahern's first term as Taoiseach was his part in the negotiations which led to the Good Friday Agreement in April 1998.
I remember one of the leaders saying to me one day when I was in negotiating with the political groupings, and he said, "Bertie, we've worked something out while you were out of the room," and I turned around and I said, "What did you work out?" He said, "You're the only one in this room, as far as we know, that hasn't murdered somebody." So fairly chilling, you know, but you just have to negotiate with these people. That's what I was getting paid to do.
It was a crucial moment in 1998 on Holy Thursday, when, from the point of view of Ahern's people, Blair was on side for Strand 2, etc., but Trimble wasn't wearing it. And the general attitude in Ahern's camp was, you know, fecht Trimble, you know, just ignore them, go with Blair, roll over the Unionists and get on with it, right? Like, I think almost any other Taoiseach said, the British Prime Minister is behind me, my advisor is behind me, and they'd go with the protocol, you know, the official kind of advice. But Bertie was watching the human being at the other side, said, this guy's back against the wall. I could be him. I could be in his shoes. And he went up and negotiated, done deal, and paved the way for the Good Friday Agreement.
I like David Trimble. I liked it, but he could lose the head in 5 seconds. You know, he had two interests, canals and opera. I certainly knew nothing about opera and didn't try, and I tried to study a bit about canals. But, you know, talking about Manchester United or the Dubs didn't quite get to his agenda. In the last few weeks, we had to come down to deal with the big calls, and the big one was that we were going to relinquish our territorial say on Northern Ireland, so removal of Articles 2 and 3. There was the issue of prisoners' releases, the North-South bodies, what role would the Republic have in North-South affairs? So, you know, what was going to happen to the old RUC and the new policing body? What was going to happen to decommissioning of arms? They were all big calls, and you know, we operated the age-old system of good negotiation, which is nothing is agreed until everything is agreed.
Bertie's role was all-embracing. What no one doubted was the totality of his commitment to it. You recall, his mother fell ill, his mother died, he left Dublin, returned to Castle Buildings the very evening that his mother had died, so that he could continue the process.
One of the things I did that week, on the Monday after doing all the meetings with the Irish parties and, you know, briefing all the Irish leaders here, which was, you know, there were very good meetings, Rory Quinn and John Bruton, Punches to Rossa, and they were understandable. I had to keep to the schedule. I had to do those briefings, even though she had died a few hours earlier.
So from that point of view, no one up there doubted his commitment to the process. And when he connected with the Unionists, and when he gave his word, he kept his word. When he said he would change Articles 2 and 3, he changed Articles 2 and 3.
The difficulty that I've always had with Bertie, and I said this to him so he won't be surprised if you broadcast this, you could get Bertie to agree to do something, you know, and the arm wrestling sometimes that negotiations take. Or you could get him to do something in the context of a very honest and frank and friendly discussion. And he will then, in a very, very sleeked way, walk away from it. And that was what I found really frustrating. You know, he made a huge contribution to the Good Friday Agreement, but, you know, we're still bedeviled by elements of that agreement which were not honoured and which were moved away from.
It is just an extraordinary confluence of history that you had Clinton, who was so sympathetic to Ireland, that you had Tony Blair, that you had Bertie, and these other very distinguished civil servants, thinkers, who weren't confined to narrow parallels. These were big thinkers, people who had an ability to think outside the box. That confluence of history was the victory.
Bertie Ahern's first term as Taoiseach corresponded with a growth in the economy which became known as the Celtic Tiger. With a £1.4 billion surplus in the national accounts, Minister for Finance Charlie McCreevy announced one of the biggest giveaway budgets in the history of the state.
There was a sense in which there was a feel-goodness coming right throughout the society and throughout the economy. And I think that the notion for Ahern and certainly once he had Charlie McCreevy with them, of slowing down the parade, as it were, raining on the parade in some sense, even just showering lightly on the parade, just ran totally against the psychology that they seem to be operating with. Now, when McCreevy's stated policy was, when I have money, I'll spend it. And in economic terms, that's just very unorthodox.
If you go back and look at what we achieved that particular period of time, you'll see we ran enormous budget surpluses. We reduced the national debt from 67% to 26 or 27%. I set up the National Pension Reserve Fund. So therefore we did something right regarding the public credit and reduced taxation at the same time. Yes, expenditure was increased in a number of areas, but we had always promised the Irish people that if they went through the harsh times with us in the 80s and 90s, when things got better, they would improve their lot as well.
What would have happened was, if we had built up a huge surplus now, instead of spending it back then, we'd be spending it now to counteract the downturn in the world economy, to counteract the other downturn that's there. But the reason we can't have a fiscal stimulus in Ireland is that we spent the money at the time when we had it, and that's called pro-cyclical policy. That's where you spend, if you like, everything's on an upswing and you add to the upswing. Whereas economics would say, when the private sector and the markets are on upswing, the government should moderate that. And then when the private market turns down, the government should compensate by swinging into place in a positive way. And that's what's being done in the States and being done in Germany and being done in the UK. So we can't do that.
Yes, we spent more money on health. Why? Because there was a need to spend more money in health. Yes, we increased the state old age pension. Why? Because it was too low. Yes, we increased the number of teachers, because to have a good education system, you have to have teachers. Yes, we increased lots of social welfare areas, and we increased benefits, because that was the way to go. And we gave the Irish people the fruits to go. And yet at the same time, we built large budget surpluses, we reduced the national debt, and we increased the number employed in Ireland to well over 2 million people. So therefore everybody gained and benefited by it as well. And when the economic tide turned against us in 2002, I brought back public expenditure to half the amount that there was, and continued that into 2004 as well.
In 2002, despite a downturn in economic growth, Bertie Ahern was re-elected Taoiseach, and Fianna Fáil returned to power in coalition with the Progressive Democrats. Ahern proved hugely popular with the electorate.
As a country, you had enormous amounts of wealth rolling in, taxation levels, income levels were always higher than were being projected, and you had vast amounts of money pouring into the exchequer. And you know, my regret was that an awful lot of this was misspent and not managed in the best interest of the people. In
some respects, I think Bertie Ahern may have been the luckiest Taoiseach we ever had, because he inherited an economy that was already moving from the Rainbow government and was in a position to surf the crest of the wave. My big problem with Bertie Ahern after that is that when it came to making tough decisions, he bottled it. He fudged it on every single occasion. He threw our money at solving every problem. He never made a hard decision in his tenure as Taoiseach. It was throw money at every problem, buy off the trade unions, buy votes. It was soft option always.
The problem, Matt, was that Bertie Ahern's great vice was the vice that we all accepted. You can go back over the media over the last 10 years and see how we attacked Bertie Ahern, and you won't find much of an attack dog creature in the media. We let him go. I know I let him go. I know that I was uncritical of him when I should have been more critical. We let the drift go. Peace was coming in the north. We were all getting rich. Let's not ask too many questions of this goose, lest we kill it. And so Bertie Ahern represented the unquestioning aspects of Irish life, and I have to say I'm guilty of being unquestioning.
In 2004, Ahern oversaw Ireland's presidency of the European Council, and by 2006, he had become the second longest-serving Taoiseach after Eamon de Valera. However, it was during this second term that questions began to arise about Bertie Ahern's finances.
Bertie operated with a political mentality which was completely shaped by Haughey. It was the same kind of machine politics. It was the same idea of power mattering more than anything you do with that power. And it was the same kind of brilliant mix of populism on the one side and actually a deep conservatism on the other side. But Bertie chose to project his personality by looking at everything Charlie did and doing the opposite. So Charlie dealt with money by a kind of genius, which was being flagrant about it, by just making it a fact that Charlie Hoy is an incredibly rich man and has more money than you're ever going to have. Bertie did the exact opposite, which was, I have no money at all, I'm not interested in money, I just have a little house, and if I can have a little pint now and again and go to a football match, I'm happy. He brilliantly kind of constructed the opposite persona.
When that first story broke about Bertie taking money and so on, no one could believe it. And it wasn't that they couldn't believe you'd take money, but they thought there'd be nothing untoward because Bertie was everyman, you know. Most people could identify with him, you know. Most people in the working middle class could say, God, there he was, he had a broken marriage. He needed money, he was getting it from all sides, so someone gives him a few quid, you know. Who are these people wagging their fingers at Bertie? Yes, he might have got a few quid. And, you know, there was a genuine outpouring of sympathy for him. I do think that happened.
Questions about Ahern's finances persisted throughout the 2007 election campaign. However, despite this, he was returned as Taoiseach for a third term, leading another coalition government.
As time went on then, the story became so complicated. And it wasn't quite adding up, and it was beginning to turn into something else. This was not nice. This was not our Bertie. This began to look more systematic. This began to look like it just wasn't a whip round from a few friends for a dig out for a pal in trouble. There was a lot more money involved than anybody had thought. And all that went along with that. Now, his political enemies made hay with that for a while. But eventually then the people began to look at it and say, there's more to this. This is not so good. And the end was not very pretty.
His career ended in something close to ruins. And I mean, at time of this discussion, we're awaiting the result of the Mahon Tribunal. We don't know what it's going to say, but it's hanging over him like a sword of Damocles. So I don't think he feels all that lucky.
No,
and I think
but already, Declan, I think you can actually probably predict that the history books will be kind to him because there is this cut-off.
But the history books only write about you when you're dead.
Some of Bertie Ahern's particularly controversial evidence before the Mahon Tribunal, he made a statement that he'd received political donations for personal use. And then the suggestion there was that therefore it was off bounds for investigation. But if you're a public official, a public elected politician, elected on public trust, it's irrelevant if you receive a donation and you use it for personal or political ends. You received a donation.
One of the mysteries in relation to Bertie is actually what did he do with money? All we have is this evidence of very large amounts of money going into bank accounts and various bank accounts. And there's no real expression of that money in terms of his lifestyle. Bertie seems to have had a miserable life. You know, Bertie's life was 18 hours a day doing constituency politics, you know, going around and opening hairdresser shops, you know, dealing with the most kind of ground down detail of constituency politics as well as national politics. And there's no evidence that actually he got any fun out of whatever money he got. And you kind of feel a bit sorry for him in that sense, you know. I mean, it's one thing to have been brought down by getting money that you actually got a great deal of pleasure out of. It's kind of pretty sad to be brought down by money that you don't seem to have really enjoyed in the first place.
In the end of the day, I'm a realist. Most politicians get into some controversy or another, and the tribunal stuff just became endless for me. If it was a health press conference, it was the tribunal. If it was environment press conference, it was the tribunal. If it was something about the budget, it ended at the tribunal. So it's just endless. And then you're distracting from, you know, from the work that's going on. In fact, the credit crunch started in August 2007, and I was still Taoiseach up until April. I can't remember being asked a good question about the credit crunch in that period when I should have been asked it every day. I was being asked about the tribunal. So my decision and calculation was made that the Irish people didn't deserve that, or neither did the government. The government have to get on with governing for the people. And if it was just about me, that was the wrong thing to be talking about.
I've never received a corrupt payment, and I've never done anything to dishonour any office that I've ever held. I know that some people will feel that some aspects of my finances are unusual. I truly regret if this has caused any confusion or worry in people's minds. All of these issues arose in a period when my family, personal and professional situations were rapidly changing, and I made the best decisions I could in the circumstances in which I found myself. I know in my heart of hearts that I've done no wrong and wronged no one.
He never let on to any of us that resignation was anywhere on his mind. And so that final meeting, which took place just a few hours before he walked onto the steps of the building, some of the ministers were quite shocked when he made the announcement. One or two of them begged him to stay on. And there was just a complete shock when he said that he felt that the difficulties he had been in had gone on so long that really he had become a difficulty for the government in himself, and he'd prefer to move on.
It is my intention to tender my resignation to President McAleese on Tuesday, the 6th of May. On that date, I will also tender my resignation as Uachtaráin Fianna Fáil.
Following the resignation of Bertie Ahern, Brian Cowan succeeded him as Taoiseach in May 2008.
Oh, look, has there ever been a tougher baptism, a tougher induction into the role of Taoiseach? Where, I mean, was there any sunlight period for him?
Some people arrive in office fully fledged and able for office, like Gareth Fitzgerald, you know, they seem to assume the mantle, or John Bruton. Others grow into it, like Bertie Ahern, they grow into the office. And it was wrong to think that Brian Cowan was ready for office. He had it almost thrust upon him. He was thereaway working in finance, a hard Fianna Fáil apparatchik, and suddenly he's Taoiseach in the middle of the most traumatic recession in the history of the state.
It's interesting, you know, even as close as you are to the job, and I work very closely with Bertie Ahern as Taoiseach, for example, and Minister for Finance and Minister for Foreign Affairs. When you go around the other side of the table and you're the number one guy, it's different, you know, even though you can be number two for some time. It does take a while for you to grow into that job in that sense, even though you'd be observing it at close quarters. And you're perceived differently. You know, you're now the Taoiseach.
I mean, we know that Brian Cowan is the unluckiest Taoiseach in the history of the state. You know, the idea of being given this kind of huge Christmas present and then opening it and finding that, you know, Santi thought you were a bad boy and you've just got the ashes, you know, which is really what happened to him. I mean, at a personal level, you just have to feel terribly sorry for someone who achieves the great ambition of anybody in politics and then finds himself with a nightmare scenario, really, where everything is falling around his ears.
Just over a month after being elected Taoiseach, Brian Cowan faced his first major setback when the Lisbon Treaty was rejected by the electorate.
In a democracy, the will of the people as expressed at the ballot box is sovereign. The government accepts and respects the verdict of the Irish people.
Although the Lisbon Treaty was subsequently passed in a future referendum, the problems in the economy continued to beleaguer his government.
Feeling sorry for Brian Cowan is slightly lessened by the fact that, of course, he himself was a contributor to the circumstances that he found himself in. You know, he had been Minister of Finance. He'd been in that government all through the years of madness, and to some extent he was reaping what he had sown.
Brian Cowan had been Minister for Finance for 4 budgets. He, in essence, had been the person with his hands on the steering wheel for 4 budgets in relation to the economy. And throughout that period, there was a loss of competitiveness that we had suffered. The very high prices that we had, our price levels were the highest in the euro area. the highest in Europe, bar Denmark, for an ordinary basket of goods. Our wages had gone through the roof, and our property market was out of this world in terms of the prices that people were paying. So nobody stopped to think about where we were going. So they were in denial in relation to the challenges that we faced. As he took over, the mistakes which were there in terms of not addressing the imbalances in the economy were clearly set to jump up and bite whoever was the next Taoiseach. And it turned out it was him himself.
Well, when I became Taoiseach in May of 2008, if you're looking at our economic prospects, for example, International Monetary Fund, the ESRI, the OECD, they were suggesting growth in 2009 would be 3%. I mean, no one saw the game-changing collapse that happened in terms of international finance. Lehman Brothers just wasn't supported by government, went out of business. The impact that had straight away, it sort of emphasized, if the integrated nature of international capital, where the whole banking system in the developed world took a huge hit.
When the ESRI suggested in June of 2008 that the country was in recession, I actually got phone calls from people who said, this is just an ESRI problem. And if you start talking about recession, you'll just talk us into it. So we were very, very far away from any kind of reality.
Of course, it's a huge challenge, but the idea that my crystal ball was any different in the Department of Finance than the IMF or the ESRI or the OECD, of course, is sort of an argument that doesn't get you anywhere. The important thing is, when something happens, what are you going to do about it?
By September in 2008, things were really, really difficult. And in Ireland, our banks were running into enormous trouble. They began to import wholesale money from other banks and lend it to business, particularly to builders and developers and in the property market. And they owed to international money markets. And in September 2008, it became very clear that this was insurmountable for the banks on their own. On a night at the end of September, the banks went to the government and they said, we're in awful trouble. Anglo-Irish Bank couldn't fund itself that night. If they were in that trouble, the problem was the message would go out, all Irish banks were in the trouble. So we had a crisis. So they went to the government and they said, what can we do? The central bank was called in, the regulator was called in, the government was there that night, the Department of Finance, and they decided that they would have to give a guarantee to the banking system. So they gave the most significant bank guarantee that anybody really has ever given.
We're going in very deep into the banking system, and we have to ensure that the taxpayer is protected in relation to that intervention.
When the dust settled, people said, well, what have we done? So we've given a big guarantee. So, well, how much have we guaranteed? It turned out to be 440 billion euro.
But it seems to me that this is the banker's solution. And while I am supportive of the bill, there's a lot in it that frankly turns my stomach.
A very momentous event clearly took place. Who approached whom? I'm sure he can remember.
By Monday evening, it was clear to us in the government that the huge battering which the share prices had taken in the Irish banks and the stock exchange reflected a general collapse in market confidence in the whole Irish banking sector.
In October 2008, Finance Minister Brian Lenihan delivered a controversial budget. The proposal to introduce means testing for medical cards for the over 70s caused a huge public outcry, which subsequently led to revisions of the budget. The government then introduced more controversial measures throughout 2009 to tackle the economic crisis. These included the nationalisation of the Anglo-Irish Bank, the National Asset Management Agency. An emergency budget followed in December by another budget considered the harshest in decades.
We're spending at 2009 levels. Our tax revenues are down to 2003 levels. That's not sustainable. Bring back your expenditure and bring up your revenue when growth returns to the economy. That's the basic plan. And we've been involved in that in two budgets during the course of 2009, having to raise taxes in April, having to cut expenditures in December. And the confidence that that gives the international community that Ireland is determined to manage its own affairs is the issue that will help effect recovery more quickly.
The disconnect with Brian Cohen is the gap between what everyone who knows him tells you about him, that he is a lovely, decent, gentle, shy man, And this gruff, take it by the scruff of the neck, grab the country, put it back in the rails thing that the media built up in the early days in order to annoy Hearn. And fundamentally, he retreats behind jargon as a way of masking his shyness. But as regards the actual doing of the job, he does the job fine. He's just not very good at spinning the job he's doing.
And if your tax revenues are down by a third, how can you spend the same amount of money you had when you had a third more? People understand that. They have household budgets themselves. And what they expect me to do is, you go and do your job and let the people decide whenever it comes up whether they want you to continue to do it. That's democracy. But in the meantime, you don't get up every morning saying, I wonder what would they like me to do today. They expect you to get on with their job, the same as they're having to get on with their job, if they still have one.
Brian Cowan was elected as leader of Fianna Fáil because he is the great tribal leader. If you want somebody to stick it to Fine Gael, Brian Cowan is your man. What he's not, however, is a Taoiseach who transcends Fianna Fáil. He's loyal internally to Fianna Fáil and to the people that are around him. He believes passionately in Fianna Fáil, but he can't communicate a sense that he's a national leader beyond that. And in the circumstances he found himself, where people were looking for national leadership, were looking for somebody who actually could make a really fundamental break with many of the aspects of Fianna Fáil's past, Brian Cowan, in many ways, I think, was the wrong man in the job. He didn't have the capacity to convince people that he was above the machine politics of Fianna Fáil, that he was above the kind of tribal mentality, that he could actually take a longer view and look at the big picture and think about, okay, this is a country which is in really, really profound trouble, which needs to radically rethink itself. And there's nothing in Brian Cowan's career, and there's nothing in what he's done as Taoiseach that suggests that he's someone who is capable of reinventing Irish politics, which is what a Taoiseach now has to do.
Just a quick look ahead to one of the highlights for our Monday night here on 3 at 9 o'clock tomorrow evening. We're showcasing My Bigger, Fatter Gypsy Wedding. It promises to be really eye-opening stuff as the party and the dress is bigger than ever. More on that tomorrow night at 9. Next up, though, it's the best of Ireland AM.